Let me tell you a story. About 10 years ago, me and my family, we went up to go see my grandparents, who live up in Lewiston. And I went with my parents, my sister, and my aunt, who took a separate car there. And while we were there, all the adults were in the front lawn having an argument about what we were going to do next, or where we're going to go eat next. And me and my sister were sitting in a car, and I began to do what I do best, and I started to annoy my sister. And I did that by crawling up into the driver's seat. And I started fiddling with the car controls, taking the steering wheel, twisting it from left to right, until eventually I see this kind of lever. And the whole time my sister is yelling at me, telling me to stop what I'm doing and go back to the back seat, but I do not listen. Instead, I grab this lever, push this button down, and I pull it back, putting the car into neutral. Now, my grandma's house is on this slope, and at the very end of this slope is this intersection that could get very busy sometimes. And as I pulled it back, the car was in neutral, and it started rolling backwards. And for those 5 seconds, I was absolutely terrified. It felt like I could see death because I could see the rearview mirror, and I could see that intersection with cars going just whizzing by. But the fear, of course, only lasted for a little bit because my aunt luckily parked behind us, and we put a nice dent into the front of it. Now, a lot of people in the Bible look at death, and they are able to stay faithful. So, if you will, please turn over to 1 Samuel 17, verses 48 and 49. And in here, we see David and Goliath. We see David, who has just gotten rid of his armor and his sword, and he decided to use a slingshot with 5 smooth stones. And he's standing there in front of Goliath, this absolute mountain of a man who's willing to kill him. And verse 48 states this: "Then it happened, when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground." If this was anyone else, they would have died. But because David had faith in God, he was able to stay faithful in the face of death. He was able to look at Goliath and be able to defeat him because of his faith. Now, turning over to Hebrews 11, verse 28, it says this: "By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them." This is a reference to Moses and the Passover, which begins in Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 30. But going back to all the way over to Exodus chapter 6, we see God kind of preparing for this. He sends in a plague of frogs, a plague of locusts. He gives Moses and his brother Aaron the power to turn a staff into a snake. And God even turns the Nile River into a river of blood. And after all of this, God goes to Moses and Aaron, and he gives them instructions for the Jewish people. Then the Jewish people were to take this lamb that is, by all senses, pure. It is a young male that's white as snow and unblemished. And they were to take this pure lamb, they were to cut it open in order to kill it. And they were to take its blood and paint their doors of their households red. And they were then to take this lamb and cook it over a fire and eat it with bitter herb and unleavened bread. And while they were eating, God would send in this angel of death to kill the firstborn of every household who did not follow these rules. And for the Egyptians, this would be terrifying, sure. But for the Jewish people, this would also be terrifying, as they would have to sit there and stay faithful that God wouldn't also, that this tragedy wouldn't also happen to them. And they would have to sit there and eat while a clap of thunder is heard or a roar of flame. that not even cattle were spared from. And because of this, the Jewish people were able to stay faithful in the midst of death. Now, turning over to Luke 23, verses 44 and 46, we see Jesus up on the cross. And 44 starts with, "It was now about the 6th hour, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, because the sun was obscured and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' Having said this, he breathed his last." Jesus was able to stay faithful, not just in the face of death, but into death. And this is important because, as Joshua one night states, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified nor dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Life is short, and it can feel random and sporadic at times. So we need to stay faithful because we don't know when our end will come. So when camp begins to end and you start to head home, I want you to think, when will your death come? Now, it may not be as something as obvious as a gigantic soldier or an angel of death or even a cross that we have to carry and be nailed to. But please, I implore you, stay faithful all the time, even into death.